For years, she silenced attorneys, shattered lives, and ruled her courtroom like a queen on a throne, until one man flipped the script and had her arrested in front of everyone. Inside the Fulton County Courthouse, Georgia, the air wasn't heavy from humidity. It was thick with fear, tension, and decades of unspoken truths. Anyone who walks through the stained glass window knows the unshakable truth. Judge Margot Ellington is the law. She didn't need to shout. Her voice, always calm, always cold, carried the weight of finality. With a single glance over her reading glasses, she could reduce seasoned attorneys to silence. Her courtroom wasn't a place for justice. It was a stage for her power. But all empires fall. And when the tables finally turned, it wasn't with noise. It was with one devastating moment of reckoning. Before we dive into this shocking mystery, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you love thrilling, jaw-dropping stories, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun cast long amber slats through the stained glass windows of the Fulton County Courthouse, painting streaks of color across the marble floors, as if the building itself were trying to remember what justice looked like. But inside, the air was thick. Not from Georgia's usual humidity, but from something heavier, older, something woven into the bones of the courthouse itself. Whispers clung to the walls like mildew, murmurs about missing files, closed-door sessions, and rulings that never made sense no matter how many laws you quoted. Everyone who passed through the courthouse doors knew the same unspoken rule. Don't challenge Judge Margot Ellington unless you're ready to lose more than just your case. For 21 years, she had ruled her courtroom with a presence so chilling, even the echo of her gavel sounded like a verdict. She didn't yell. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. One glance over her rimless spectacles and attorneys knew. Their careers, their clients, their credibility could all be shredded in a matter of minutes. And yet, on this particular morning, something was different. Subtle, but undeniable. The guards at the entrance exchanged longer glances than usual. A veteran bailiff paused before opening the courtroom doors, his hand hovering just a second too long. The courthouse breathed in a slow, uneasy breath, and then Jamal Vaughn walked in. His suit was dark, his step measured, but it was his eyes, calm, sharp, alert, that shifted the atmosphere, like a surgeon entering an operating room with a scalpel already drawn. He didn't look around, didn't nod at the familiar faces in the gallery, didn't smile. He simply moved. Each footstep a soft, deliberate click against the stone floor. Jamal Vaughn wasn't here to argue. He was here to dismantle. Everyone knew his name, a defense attorney with a reputation for unraveling cases like puzzles, for speaking truth in places where it was most inconvenient. But even he had rarely crossed paths with Judge Ellington, and never like this. Today he wasn't just defending a man. He was stepping into the lion's den with a torch. He passed through the gallery like a current through still water. Eyes followed him, some curious, some wary, others quietly hopeful, as if they sensed something was about to crack, like watching the sky darken seconds before a storm. His client, Marcus Langston, sat already in place, hands cuffed, posture weary. He looked up at Jamal not with faith, but with fatigue, the kind born from years of believing the system had only one verdict for men who looked like him. Jamal didn't speak. He simply placed his leather briefcase on the defense table and sat, folding his hands, eyes fixed forward. Then the door behind the bench creaked open, and a hush fell over the room like a curtain dropping before a final act. Judge Margot Ellington stepped into view, regal, emotionless, and already annoyed. She didn't look at Jamal. Not yet. She didn't have to. She already knew who he was, and more importantly, she already despised what he represented. But Jamal wasn't watching her like everyone else. He wasn't intimidated by the stories or the fear she manufactured with surgical precision. He was watching her hands, the faint tremor in her left when she gripped her gavel, the pause before she sat, the almost imperceptible hesitation like a crack beginning to form beneath a seemingly flawless surface. She banged her gavel once and the courtroom rose. But in that moment Jamal knew this wasn't her courtroom anymore, not for long. What she didn't know was that hidden in Jamal's briefcase, nestled beneath pages of legal arguments and trial transcripts, was a piece of paper, one she would never expect. And before this trial was over, she wouldn't just lose a case, she'd lose everything. The trial of state versus Marcus Langston began not with a bang, but with a slow suffocation. From the moment the clerk called the case number, it felt less like the start of a legal proceeding and more like a funeral march, each step orchestrated by invisible hands pulling strings behind the curtain. Judge Margot Ellington adjusted her robe with mechanical precision, never once making direct eye contact with the defense table. She didn't have to. Her presence alone set the tone. Rigid, superior, untouchable. The courtroom was her theater, and she'd already assigned the roles. Jamal Vaughn, despite his national reputation and legal acclaim, was cast as the defiant irritant. And Marcus Langston, he was the villain, the threat, the guilty man in waiting. Marcus sat quietly, wrists still shackled despite Jamal's earlier motions for their removal. His brown eyes scanned the floor, not out of shame, but exhaustion. There was a time when Marcus had stood tall before podiums and classrooms, speaking to young men about discipline, purpose, and fighting the right battles. That man was still inside him, but now buried under layers of betrayal, loss, and a justice system that had treated his every plea for fairness as a personal insult. This courtroom wasn't built for men like him to be heard. It was built for them to be buried. The prosecutor, Vincent Caldwell, stood with the eager stiffness of a man who still believed in titles over truth. Barely 30 and already rumored to be eyeing a state senate seat, Caldwell wore ambition like a second skin. He walked to the podium with a self-satisfied smile, barely glancing at Jamal. "The state is ready to proceed, Your Honor," he said, voice polished, rehearsed. Judge Ellington gave a faint nod, barely perceptible, but enough to signal that the game had begun. Jamal didn't rise. Not yet. He studied Caldwell like a chess player sizing up a predictable opponent. He knew men like him, clever but careless, arrogant in the presence of perceived favor. And Judge Ellington had given him plenty of that. The charges against Marcus were serious, aggravated assault on a police officer during a public disturbance. According to the state, Marcus had led a protest that spiraled into chaos, culminating in a brutal attack on Officer Brian Tuller. The prosecution claimed they had video evidence, eyewitnesses, even a partial confession, but Jamal knew better. He'd seen the so-called evidence, and it was riddled with shadows. The video was cropped. The eyewitnesses were coached. The confession? A scribbled note written after 18 hours without counsel and under extreme duress. This case didn't hold water, but it didn't need to. Not with Ellington on the bench. Jamal stood slowly, finally breaking the silence. "The defense is also ready, Your Honor." His voice was calm, but every word carried an edge, sharp and deliberate. Ellington barely looked up from her file. "Let's proceed," she said flatly, and the jury began to file in. 12 faces, some curious, some tense, others already closed off. Jamal scanned them quickly. He wouldn't know where they stood until the evidence began to unfold, but he saw something else in their shifting gazes, the quiet awareness that something about this courtroom felt off. Opening statements were brief. Caldwell painted Marcus as a dangerous agitator, a man who used his influence to provoke violence and then tried to hide behind a cause. His words were fiery, almost theatrical, and every time he made a dig at Marcus's pattern of defiance, Judge Ellington allowed it to stand. No objections sustained, no lines crossed, just enough rope to hang a man without leaving fingerprints. When it was Jamal's turn, he didn't rise immediately. He waited. Let the silence press in. Let the jury feel the weight of what had just been said. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. "What you're going to see in this case," he began, "is not just how a man can be accused, but how a system can be used to make sure he stays that way." A pause. "Even when the truth says otherwise." Judge Ellington's jaw tightened. The first crack had formed. Jamal Vaughn had stood in courtrooms from Chicago to Charleston, argued before judges with tempers, egos, and vendettas. But none of them haunted him the way Margot Ellington did. As he sat at the defense table, pretending to review his notes while the prosecution prepared its first witness, the weight of his double mission bore down on him like a steel beam. On the surface, he was here to defend Marcus Langston, a man wrongfully accused and chewed up by a system that never liked men who fought back. But beneath that, in the shadows and silences between the gavel strikes, Jamal was fighting a second battle, one far more dangerous. To expose Judge Margot Ellington for what she truly was. And he was running out of time. He had spent 3 years building this case against her in secret. Quiet phone calls with disillusioned clerks. Off-the-record interviews with public defenders who dared not speak her name in public. Documents passed through back doors, late-night drop-offs, encrypted drives. One of his contacts, a former law clerk who once worked under Ellington, had confessed to seeing case files altered and bench memos edited to favor certain prosecutors and damage particular defense teams. "She doesn't even hide it," the clerk had whispered, eyes darting. "She thinks she's untouchable." And for a long time she was. Now Jamal was sitting directly in the heart of her domain, knowing full well that if he moved too soon, he'd lose Marcus. And if he waited too long, he'd lose everything. That was the dilemma. The moral and tactical razor's edge he walked. He couldn't simply accuse a sitting judge without irrefutable evidence, and even with it, the system had ways of protecting its own. He needed the right moment, the right trigger, and most of all, he needed a witness who was now missing. Caleb Rourke, former prosecutor, turned whistleblower, the man who had been prepared to testify under seal about the pattern of misconduct he'd witnessed while working alongside Ellington and certain high-profile DAs. He had agreed to meet Jamal 2 nights before the trial began, promising documents and names. But Rourke never showed. His phone went dark. His apartment was abandoned, a broken lamp, a coffee cup still warm, and the echo of footsteps that didn't belong. Jamal had reported the disappearance, but no one seemed interested. No one except him. Now, as Vincent Caldwell called his first witness to the stand, an officer, with a too-clean uniform and a too-rehearsed statement, Jamal forced himself to breathe. He needed to play this carefully. His instincts told him they were watching him. Not just Ellington, but someone else. He'd noticed the same man sitting in the gallery for the 2nd day in a row, pretending to read a legal brief that was upside down. A federal observer, or something worse? Marcus leaned over, whispering from the side of his mouth, "You good, man?" Jamal didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on Ellington, who was listening to Caldwell with an expression of thinly veiled encouragement. Her fingertips tapped rhythmically on the bench. Not nerves, but anticipation. She was confident, comfortable. That was her mistake. She thought she still had control. "I'm good," Jamal finally replied, voice low but steady. "Stay sharp." But internally, his mind spun like a storm. He had the pieces of a bombshell, financial transactions, audio clips, names, but the final thread, the smoking gun, was still out of reach. And worse, every time he rose to object or press an argument, he could feel Ellington narrowing her sights on him, not just as opposing counsel, but as a threat to her empire. The question wasn't whether Jamal could beat the case. He knew the facts were on his side. The real question, the one clawing at him, was whether he could expose her before she destroyed him first, and the clock was already ticking. Before Marcus Langston ever stood accused of assaulting a police officer, before he became a defendant in a courtroom ruled by corruption, he was a voice, clear, steady, and respected, echoing through the halls of Southside Academy. A teacher, a mentor, a former youth football coach who had once turned troubled kids into scholarship-bound students, offering not just guidance, but a future. He believed in structure, in justice, in doing things the right way. And for a long time that belief had been unshakable. But belief doesn't stop bullets from flying or protect kids from being pulled out of classrooms and thrown into the back of squad cars. Marcus had watched too many of his students, bright, wild-hearted, vulnerable, get swallowed by a system designed to fail them, and slowly something inside him began to fracture. It started with one student, a quiet 10th grader named Darian, who was arrested during a school-wide search. They claimed he had a weapon. But Marcus knew Darian, knew his home life, his fears, the way he winced at loud noises. He also knew Darian didn't even carry a cell phone, let alone a gun. The charges were dropped eventually, but not before the boy was suspended, humiliated and marked. That moment became a turning point. Marcus stopped asking permission to advocate and started demanding answers. He organized meetings, confronted the school board, and eventually began leading community forums, public gatherings that grew louder, larger, and more urgent. That's when the threats began. First, anonymous letters slipped into his school mailbox, then slashed tires, then visits from uniformed officers, unannounced, claiming they were just checking in. Still, Marcus didn't stop. He couldn't. Not after seeing firsthand the way black boys were funneled out of classrooms and into courtrooms, how their futures were signed away by biased judges and prosecutors with quotas to meet. So, he took to the streets, not with violence, but with truth. He helped organize a peaceful protest following the beating of a teenage boy by 2 officers outside a grocery store. The video went viral, the city flared, and tensions ran high. On the day of the protest, Marcus walked at the front of the march, holding a sign that read, "Our silence won't save us." That was the day everything changed. According to the official report, Marcus had incited violence, that he had instigated a confrontation that left Officer Brian Tuller with a fractured wrist and a concussion. But what the report didn't mention was that Tuller had grabbed a young woman by the throat, and Marcus had intervened, placing himself between her and the officer. Witnesses said he never raised his hands, never struck anyone. The footage that might have exonerated him mysteriously went missing. 2 hours later, Marcus was in handcuffs, face bruised, ribs cracked, charged with aggravated assault on law enforcement. The headlines were swift and brutal. Community leader turns violent, protest spirals into attack, Langston behind bars. The betrayal cut deep, not just the false charges, but the silence that followed. Colleagues distanced themselves, donors to his youth program pulled funding. Even the school where he'd given over a decade of service placed him on indefinite leave. He went from mentor to menace overnight. But through it all, Marcus never begged, never pleaded. He waited, quietly, patiently, for the right advocate, the right moment. And now, that moment had arrived, in the form of Jamal Vaughn, sitting beside him in a courtroom thick with danger. As his past flickered like shadows behind his eyes, Marcus wasn't thinking about redemption. He was thinking about reckoning, about everything that had been taken, and about the one shot they had to take it all back. Jamal Vaughn had always known that fighting injustice was a lonely road, but nothing had prepared him for this level of isolation. As the trial wore on, what started as subtle resistance became an invisible siege, closing in on him from all sides. The courtroom, once his domain, now felt like a trap. Every word scrutinized, every move watched. And not just by Judge Ellington. It was the looks from the bailiff that lingered too long. The moments when his microphone at the defense table would cut out at just the right time, the odd flicker of lights overhead during his cross-examinations. It was all small, deniable, but it built like pressure in a sealed room. Something was tightening around him. Even in his own office, he no longer felt safe. 2 nights ago, he'd returned from court to find his files moved ever so slightly. Documents he kept perfectly aligned now shifted just enough to trigger alarm. His assistant Kira had found a strange car parked across the street for 3 nights in a row. No plates, no driver, no reason. The next day, a court filing he'd submitted for Marcus mysteriously vanished from the clerk system, only to be found hours later, altered. A date changed, a paragraph missing. It was a calculated message. "We see you. We can erase you." The worst part was, he couldn't prove any of it. No security footage, no witnesses, no one willing to confirm what they all suspected, that someone was tampering with the case, with him, and that Judge Margot Ellington wasn't just biased. She was backed, protected, insulated by a web of influence that extended far beyond her bench. Jamal had tried to alert internal court oversight. No reply. He reached out to a contact in the U.S. Attorney's Office, a woman named Raina Harris he had once worked with on a civil rights case. She answered on the first ring, listened carefully, and said, "Leave it alone, Jamal. This goes higher than you know." Then she hung up. He hadn't heard from her since, and yet he pressed forward, not because he felt brave, but because he was too deep in to retreat. Every night, Jamal reviewed the evidence again, hunted for cracks in the case, looking for one undeniable truth that could expose Ellington and clear Marcus at the same time. The pressure was relentless. His sleep was fractured, dreams haunted by flickering images of men in suits, Marcus in handcuffs, Ellington's cold eyes, and that courtroom gavel striking like a war drum. One evening, after a grueling day in court, where every objection he raised was denied and the judge openly scolded him in front of the jury, Jamal sat alone in his dimly lit office. The walls felt closer than usual. The silence screamed. He poured himself a glass of water, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that he was running out of options. His key witness, Caleb Rourke, was still missing. The pressure on Marcus was mounting. The jury, while attentive, was growing weary of the legal back and forth. And Judge Ellington, she was only getting bolder, her disdain no longer concealed but weaponized. That was when Jamal noticed the envelope. It sat on his desk, unmarked, no stamp, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed with a blurry surveillance photo. It showed him, Jamal, meeting with a man in a parking garage. Caleb Rourke, the date stamp, 2 days before the trial. On the back, a handwritten note in red ink. This case isn't just about Langston. You're next. Jamal's jaw clenched. The air thickened. He stared at the paper for a long time, then slowly folded it and slipped it into his briefcase. He wasn't scared, not anymore. He was pissed. They wanted to corner him. But Jamal Vaughn didn't break under pressure. He became dangerous. She found him in the courthouse basement, where the air was damp, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a tired flicker, and no one came unless they had something to hide or something to say without being overheard. Maya Torres, the court clerk with a quiet presence and eyes that always seemed to see more than she let on, stepped from the shadows as Jamal passed by the old records room. He was on his way out, shoulders heavy, mind spinning from the day's sabotage, a key witness barred by Ellington's last-minute ruling, and the bailiff misplacing his sealed motion to dismiss. He was tired, but when he heard Maya's voice, low, urgent, he stopped cold. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, "you don't know me, but I can help you, if you're ready for the truth." Jamal turned, sharp instinct bristling. He'd seen her before, hovering near the judge's chambers, always discreet, always silent. He studied her now, late 20s, worn expression, but eyes burning with something fierce, resolve laced with fear. "You sure you want to be seen talking to me?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with suspicion. Maya hesitated, then stepped deeper into the shadows, her voice even lower. "I've been watching her for 2 years. You're not the first attorney she's tried to bury, but you might be the first one who can bring her down." Jamal's heart thudded once, hard. He gestured toward the records room and they slipped inside, closing the door behind them. Inside, surrounded by old files and the hum of forgotten secrets, Maya pulled a small thumb drive from her coat pocket. "This is sealed documents," she whispered. "Internal memos. Rulings that were doctored before they went public. Financial transfers, emails. Most of it's circumstantial. But there's one thing you'll want to see." Her hand trembled slightly as she passed it to him. A redacted transcript, buried under a different case ID. It's a conversation between Judge Ellington and Vincent Caldwell. They're talking about your client, Marcus Langston. Before the case was even filed. Jamal stiffened, stunned for just a beat. "Are you saying she coordinated the charge?" "I'm saying she designed it," Maya replied, her voice bitter. "Vincent was just the mouthpiece. She's the one who had Marcus targeted. The protest? It made her look bad. Local press was sniffing around her connections to the private security firm that roughed up those kids. Marcus was going to expose her. That's why she made him the fall guy." The walls seemed to tighten around Jamal. His pulse thundered in his ears. This was bigger than rigged rulings. This was conspiracy. Corruption with purpose. A calculated campaign to silence a man who got too close. He took the drive carefully, sliding it into his inner coat pocket like a weapon holstered. "Why now?" he asked her. "Why risk everything to help me?" Maya looked down. "Because 2 months ago I made a mistake. I shredded a memo under her orders. It was a witness statement that could have freed a man. He took a plea deal that day. I still see his face. Every night." Her eyes lifted to his. "I won't be part of it anymore." Jamal exhaled slowly, the burden in his chest shifting. Not lighter, just clearer. "You just became the most important person in this building," he said. "Stay quiet. Keep your routine. I'll take it from here." But as he stepped into the hallway, thumb drive secured, Jamal knew things were about to shift dramatically. He finally had the leverage, the matchstick. All he had to do now was light it and watch the empire burn. The cracks had been spreading for days, small at first, easy to miss if you weren't looking. But Jamal Vaughn had been looking. Every raised eyebrow from the jury, Every awkward pause from the bailiff, every tightened word from Judge Margot Ellington had been building toward this moment like a tremor beneath the surface, preparing for a quake. And now, as Officer Brian Tuller took the stand, clean-shaven, medals pinned, posture straight but too rehearsed, the courtroom felt like a bomb waiting for a spark. Jamal could sense it. The silence between each spoken word stretched too far. Even the gallery leaned forward, as if everyone collectively understood they were teetering on the edge of something irreversible. Vincent Caldwell, clearly rattled beneath his carefully pressed suit, approached the witness stand like a soldier who hadn't realized the war had changed. "Officer Tuller," he said, his voice tight, "can you walk the court through the moment you identified the defendant, Mr. Marcus Langston, at the scene of the incident?" Tuller cleared his throat. "Yes, sir. It was chaotic. There was shouting, people running. I saw Mr. Langston raise his arm in a threatening way, and I approached." Jamal rose. "Objection, Your Honor. The officer is offering a conclusion without establishing a factual basis. Threatening is a subjective term." Judge Ellington didn't even glance up. "Overruled." Jamal didn't flinch. He nodded slowly, deliberately. Then he sat back down, his expression unreadable, but the spark was already there. Caldwell continued fumbling through his direct, trying to paint Marcus as the aggressor, but the narrative was crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. Tuller stumbled. He contradicted a detail from his prior testimony. Then he hesitated when describing the angle of the confrontation. And Jamal was waiting. Coiled, precise, lethal. When cross-examination began, Jamal moved with the calm of a man who had already mapped the fall. He approached the stand, never raising his voice, but his words sliced through the courtroom like piano wire. "Officer Tuller, you said you identified my client during the protest." "Yes," the officer said. "You're certain?" "Yes." "And yet, in your original police report, filed within 12 hours of the event, Mr. Langston's name does not appear. In fact, you described the suspect as wearing a gray hoodie with a distinctive red logo." Tuller blinked. "That's correct." Jamal turned to the evidence table, pulled a photograph, and held it up. "This is Marcus Langston at the scene less than 5 minutes before the altercation, captured by a local news crew. He's wearing a navy peacoat and no hoodie at all. Can you explain the discrepancy?" The silence hit like a dropped weight. The jury shifted. The gallery murmured. Even Caldwell looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. I must have misremembered," Tuller stammered. Jamal pounced. "So, your memory was certain until it wasn't. You're under oath, officer. Which version should this jury believe? The one from the heat of the moment or the one you rehearsed for court?" "Objection," Caldwell barked. "Argumentative." "Sustained," Ellington said, but her voice cracked, not from strain but from panic. Jamal turned slowly toward her, his face a mask of calm but his eyes alive with fire. "No further questions," he said, and walked back to the defense table, each step deliberate, like the pacing of a final countdown. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. The spell Ellington had cast for over 2 decades was weakening. The jury had felt it. The gallery had witnessed it. And as Jamal glanced up one last time, he saw it flicker in her eyes just for a moment. Doubt. And that's all he needed. The collapse had begun. The air inside courtroom 4C had become a vacuum, dense, silent, watchful. The kind of stillness that didn't come from order but from tension so taut it threatened to snap with the slightest spark. Jamal Vaughn stood motionless behind the defense table, one hand resting on his briefcase, the other curled tightly into a fist beneath the surface. This was it. The moment he had been moving toward in quiet, calculated steps for the last 3 years. His pulse was steady, but every instinct screamed that once he crossed this line, there was no going back. Not for Marcus, not for himself, not for anyone in that courtroom. Across from him, Judge Margot Ellington sat with a rigid posture, her gavel close, her lips pursed in manufactured poise, but he could see it now. The flicker of nerves behind the lenses of her glasses, the slight quiver at the edge of her jaw. She knew something was coming. She just didn't know when or how hard it would hit. It started with a single sentence. "Your Honor," Jamal said, his voice calm but resonant, cutting through the stillness like a scalpel. "Before we proceed to the next witness, I need to address a matter of urgent judicial concern." Ellington's eyes narrowed. "This better not be another attempt to derail my courtroom, Mr. Vaughn." "It's not about your courtroom," Jamal replied smoothly. "It's about your conduct." A slow rustle passed through the gallery. Vincent Caldwell sat bolt upright, his hands frozen mid-page. The court reporter stopped typing. Even the jury stiffened, instinctively understanding they were no longer just jurors in a criminal trial. They were now witnesses to a reckoning. Judge Ellington leaned forward. "I suggest you tread very carefully." Jamal stepped away from the table and opened his briefcase. "I intend to. Carefully, thoroughly, and on the record." From the briefcase he withdrew a folder, thick, labeled, secured with a black ribbon. He laid it gently on the podium like a sacred offering and then met Ellington's eyes directly. "Contained in this folder," he said, "are sealed memos, internal court communications, and financial records obtained legally and submitted to the U.S. Attorney's Office. They implicate this court, your bench, in a deliberate and ongoing pattern of case tampering, judicial misconduct, and unlawful coordination with the prosecution in not only this case but at least 7 others over the last 5 years." The room erupted in whispers. Urgent, electric, chaotic. Ellington's gavel slammed down once, twice, 3 times. "Mr. Vaughn, you are in contempt." "No, Your Honor," Jamal interrupted, stepping forward bold and unmoved. "You're in violation." He held up a printed transcript. "Here is a redacted recording of a meeting between yourself and Mr. Caldwell 2 weeks before this trial began, in which you discussed strategic suppression of defense motions, the inadmissibility of key video evidence, and the tactical framing of my client's arrest as a political distraction." Vincent's face went white. That conversation was... "You can't!" Jamal cut him off with a stare. "Sit down, counselor. We'll get to your part in this shortly." The gallery was on fire with energy now. Phones raised, reporters furiously scribbling, spectators murmuring in stunned disbelief. The court officers looked to one another, unsure whether to intervene or observe. And Judge Ellington? For the first time in 24 years, she looked afraid. "You've built a career out of intimidation and manipulation," Jamal continued, voice rising, not in anger, but in righteous clarity. "But your power was borrowed, and now it's being returned." He handed the folder to the bailiff. "Submit that into the official record, sealed copy to the DOJ liaison." Ellington rose from the bench, trembling. "This is outrageous. I will not be lectured." "No, Your Honor," Jamal said coldly. "You will be investigated." The room held its breath, and the walls of her empire began to shake. Just when the courtroom seemed to be spiraling beyond Judge Ellington's control, when the weight of Jamal's evidence had shifted the balance of power and the crowd leaned forward like an audience hungry for justice, the betrayal hit like a blade in the back, swift, silent, and devastating. It came not from the bench, nor from the gallery, but from the very person standing behind the prosecution's table, Vincent Caldwell. Until now, he'd been nothing more than a tool, eager, ambitious, painfully rehearsed. But now he stepped forward, his voice breaking the chaos like a stone through glass. "Your Honor," he said, loud enough to command silence. "Before this evidence is formally entered, I have a statement for the court." Jamal turned toward him slowly, his eyes narrowing. He knew Vincent was rattled. He had watched him unravel during the cross-examinations, seen the sweat, the frantic glances at Ellington, the visible fear that came with the realization that the floor was giving way beneath him. But this wasn't fear anymore. This was something else. A shift. A choice. Ellington's eyes flared with alarm. "Vincent," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "don't say another word." But it was too late. "I won't lie for you anymore," he said, his voice cracking at first, then growing steadier. "I can't." He looked at Jamal, then at the jury, and finally at the gallery. "It's true. I met with Judge Ellington prior to this trial. We discussed how to shape the case against Mr. Langston. She instructed me on which evidence would be suppressed. She edited my opening statement. She even," his voice caught, "suggested how to coach the lead witness." A gasp rippled through the courtroom like a wave breaking against stone. Jamal stood frozen, unsure whether to feel vindicated or wary. Because the way Vincent was speaking, the rhythm, the almost too perfect remorse, felt rehearsed. And then came the moment that made everything twist sideways. "I did it because I trusted her," Vincent said. "Because I believed in her. She's not just my mentor. She's my godmother." The words landed like a detonation. The room erupted. Ellington stood, visibly shaking now, eyes wide with fury. "Vincent," she snapped. "You ungrateful—" "You made me believe this was how power worked," he cut her off. "That the ends justified the means, but it doesn't. Not anymore. Not when people's lives are being destroyed just to protect your reputation." Ellington stepped from the bench, ignoring the murmuring court officers now edging toward her. "You don't understand what you're doing," she hissed. "This isn't just about me. There are people, systems, that protect this institution. You think they'll let you walk away from this clean?" Vincent's hands trembled, but he stood his ground. "Then let them come for me. I'll testify. I'll give a full deposition." Jamal watched it unfold with a strange, hollow ache in his chest. He had dreamed of exposing her, dismantling the facade, but never imagined her fall would come at the hands of her own protege. And yet, even as Vincent's confession echoed across the courtroom, something about it felt too convenient. The timing, the language, the desperation. Then it hit him. Vincent wasn't flipping to bring her down. He was flipping to save himself. By pinning the conspiracy on Ellington alone, he was throwing her to the wolves, sacrificing his godmother to carve out his own immunity. The betrayal wasn't just Ellington's, it was Jamal's too. The man who had orchestrated part of this injustice was now repositioning himself as a whistleblower, a survivor of manipulation. And worse, it might work. Jamal tightened his jaw, eyes locked on Vincent. He wasn't done. Not yet. Because some truths don't collapse under pressure, they sharpen. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed like a drumbeat down the corridor behind the bench, growing louder with each passing second. Everyone in the courtroom could feel it. The tension, the inevitability, the unmistakable sense that something long protected was about to be torn down in the open. Judge Margot Ellington stood rigid at the bench, her gavel now resting uselessly at her side. The authority she once wielded like a blade no longer clung to her robe. It hung limp, stripped by the weight of the evidence, the betrayal, and her own arrogance. Jamal Vaughn remained standing, eyes fixed on the judge with a gaze that was not vengeful, but resolute, because this wasn't about revenge. This was about accountability. And after years of whispered rumors, sealed files, and lives crushed beneath her gavel, the reckoning had arrived. The double doors at the rear of the courtroom burst open with a hollow clang, and 2 federal agents entered, sharp suits and sharper expressions cutting through the stunned silence. The taller of the 2 stepped forward, flashing a Department of Justice badge. "Judge Margot Ellington," he announced, voice firm. "We are acting under a federal warrant for your immediate arrest. You are being charged with obstruction of justice, bribery, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and abuse of judicial authority." The gallery erupted. Some gasped. Others whispered. Phones began recording. Jurors, stunned into silence, turned their heads in unison, like spectators at a tragic performance. But Margot Ellington didn't move. She gripped the bench like a woman trying to hold on to the last piece of a crumbling empire. "This is outrageous," she spat. "I demand a private consultation with my counsel before—" "You'll have access to an attorney," the agent replied coolly. "But this arrest is non-negotiable." A court officer, someone who had worked under her for years, approached her now with a pair of stainless steel handcuffs. For a moment, Ellington looked at him with disbelief, as though expecting him to refuse, but he didn't. He only looked her in the eye and said, "Please stand, Your Honor." The words stung. Slowly, stiffly, Judge Ellington stepped away from the bench that had once been her throne. As the cuffs clicked around her wrists, the sound seemed to reverberate like a bell tolling for the end of something larger than just one woman's career. She turned, her chin still lifted, but her eyes, once sharp and cold, were now wide, frantic, unmoored. Her gaze locked with Jamal's for a fleeting second, and in that look was everything. Anger, disbelief, the final remnants of a pride unraveling. "You did this," she whispered to him. Jamal didn't flinch. "No," he said softly. "You did." With each step she took toward the courtroom doors, the silence deepened, thick with the weight of what had just unfolded. Margot Ellington, who had spent decades sentencing others without remorse, was now being led through the same doors she once watched so many pass through in shackles. The irony wasn't poetic, it was justice. As the doors swung shut behind her, the gavel remained abandoned on the bench, a hollow symbol of power that had finally lost its force. The courtroom was still. A collective breath held for too long was finally exhaled. Jamal lowered his head, the flood of emotion crashing down on him all at once. Relief, exhaustion, vindication, but not triumph. There was no triumph in watching justice delayed finally catch up. Only a quiet, solemn understanding that this was one battle in a war far from over. Still, for the first time in years, the courtroom belonged to the law again, and its most dangerous judge had just fallen. The gavel that once silenced truth now lay abandoned, a hollow relic atop a bench stripped of its power. For a long, charged moment, the courtroom existed in suspended time, its occupants stunned, hushed, processing the impossible. Judge Margot Ellington, the iron-fisted ruler of this chamber for over 2 decades, had been let out in cuffs. The shadow she cast had lifted, but the air still trembled with the weight of what came next. All eyes turned to the man behind the defense table, Marcus Langston, still seated, still shackled, as if justice hadn't quite reached him yet. He hadn't moved, hadn't breathed deeply since the agents took Ellington away. After everything, after the lies, the manipulation, the humiliation, he was still in chains. The truth had finally stood up for him, but freedom was still just a whisper away. Then came the quiet shuffle of movement from the side door as a new figure entered the courtroom, a man with salt and pepper hair, calm eyes, and the kind of presence that didn't demand authority but simply carried it. Judge Harold Brennan, retired, but called back for emergency appointments like this, stepped up to the bench with no flair, no theatrics, just purpose. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the courtroom that had just witnessed a reckoning. "Mr. Vaughn," he said, his voice deep and steady, "I've reviewed the case file, the transcript of today's proceedings, and the supplemental evidence submitted regarding judicial misconduct. Given the gravity of what's transpired here." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. "This court must now do what Judge Ellington never had the courage to do. Follow the law without prejudice." Jamal rose slowly, his breath caught in his chest. His voice, though weary, was clear. "Your Honor, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client, Marcus Langston, on the grounds of prosecutorial misconduct, judicial bias, and the irreversible compromise of his right to a fair trial." The room went still again. Judge Brennan didn't hesitate. "Motion granted." The words fell like a cleansing rain. "The charges against Marcus Langston are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Bailiff, remove his restraints." The sharp click of the handcuffs unlocking was louder than any gavel could ever be. Marcus blinked, as if waking from a nightmare he had lived too long inside. He flexed his hands, staring at them, as if unsure they were really his again. Jamal placed a hand on his shoulder, not as a lawyer comforting a client, but as a brother anchoring another man back into the world. Marcus slowly stood. The gallery, which had held its breath through it all, erupted, not in cheers, not in applause, but in the raw, reverent murmurs of people who had just witnessed the impossible. Reporters jotted feverishly, court officers shifted uneasily, and Vincent Caldwell remained frozen behind the prosecution table, his once bright future now fading beneath the weight of complicity. Marcus turned to Jamal. "I don't even know what to say," he whispered. "You don't have to," Jamal replied. "This moment was earned. You survived it." But even as the chains fell away, Jamal knew this wasn't an ending. It was a reckoning long overdue. For every Marcus Langston, there were 10 others still fighting, still waiting, still praying the system would recognize their humanity. Judge Ellington had fallen, but the institution that made her possible, that war still waited. Still, for now, for this day, truth had broken through, and that was worth everything. Marcus Langston, freed from his literal chains and the invisible ones that had bound him for years, lingered near the exit, his eyes reflecting both relief and uncertainty about what lay ahead. The symbolic fall of a tyrant had sparked hope, yet it also left behind a haunting silence that questioned whether this was true justice or just a temporary correction. Jamal finally stepped outside, blinking beneath the weight of cameras and flashing microphones, but he didn't stop to speak. He simply raised a hand to shield his face and walked past the noise. The victory felt distant now, not hollow, but incomplete, like a battle won in a war still raging. His phone vibrated with calls from advocacy groups, former clients and reporters hungry for quotes. But the only message he opened was a short, cryptic one from a block number. Ellington wasn't the only one. Watch the appellate circuit. Jamal paused, standing on the courthouse steps, the city buzzing behind him, the sky already darkening. He knew this was far from over. Judge Ellington was the face of corruption, but she wasn't its architect. She was a symptom. The disease ran deeper, into backroom deals, private prison profits, and the unspoken network of favors traded behind closed doors. The courtroom might have belonged to justice today, but tomorrow the shadows would regroup. Inside, Marcus quietly gathered his things. No handcuffs now, no guards, just the long walk back to the world that had left him behind. He turned one last time toward the defense table, his voice quiet but firm. "Thank you," he said. Jamal didn't turn to look. He just nodded once, eyes already locked on the courthouse across the street, the appellate division, where decisions were made in silence and darkness. As Marcus stepped into freedom, Jamal's mind was already miles ahead. There were other judges, other prosecutors, other Ellingtons, and if no one else would expose them, he would. Because justice wasn't a single moment in a courtroom. It was a fight that had just begun. In today's world, the fall of Margot Ellington resonates as more than just a courtroom drama. It's a mirror reflecting the deeply rooted flaws in our justice system. The story reminds us that power, when left unchecked, often becomes a weapon against the vulnerable. Judge Ellington represents the real-world figures who hide behind titles and institutions while quietly dismantling lives. Marcus Langston's wrongful prosecution mirrors the countless individuals today, especially black men, who are unfairly targeted, silenced, or forgotten within a system designed to protect itself. Jamal Vaughn's tireless pursuit of truth shows us that one voice, when backed by courage and truth, can shake even the most immovable structures. The lesson here is clear. Accountability doesn't start with systems, it starts with people. Whether we're in positions of power or simply bystanders, we each have a role in calling out injustice and demanding fairness. Silence protects corruption. But courage, when consistent, informed, and relentless, can spark real change. In our communities, our courts, our classrooms, justice must be fought for. Not just in dramatic moments, but every day, in every act of resistance, no matter how small. Because justice delayed isn't just justice denied, it's freedom stolen. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and comment one if you found the story meaningful. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one.